The plane was falling from the sky. Everyone screamed. The captain's voice shook. "I can't control it. We're going to die." Passengers cried and hugged each other. Death was coming fast. Then a calm woman stood up from her seat. She walked to the cockpit. Nobody knew she had a secret skill that would change everything in the next 60 seconds. Before you watch full story, comment below. From which country are you watching? Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 had been climbing through 37,000 feet when the first compressor blade failed in the number 2 engine, sending a cascade of titanium fragments through systems that were never designed to withstand such catastrophic internal damage. Captain Marcus Webb had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, had logged over 18,000 hours across 5 continents, had successfully handled everything from engine failures to severe weather to hydraulic malfunctions, and he knew within the first 8 seconds that this was different. This was a scenario from the Emergency Procedures Manual. This wasn't something that could be solved by following the bold-faced items and making a diversion to the nearest suitable airport. This was physics and mathematics telling him that he and his 241 passengers were already dead, that their bodies just hadn't accepted the reality yet. The initial explosion, muffled but unmistakable, had caused heads to turn throughout the cabin, passengers looking toward the right wing, where a brief flash of orange had been visible through the windows before disappearing into the slipstream. Flight attendants had immediately begun moving toward their stations with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral despite the sick feeling already forming in their stomachs, because they'd heard that sound before in training videos, in accident reconstruction briefings, in the nightmares that followed too many years of safety seminars. First Officer Sarah Chun was already pulling up the engine instruments when the second failure hit. This one in the electrical system as damaged turbine fragments punctured through containment boundaries that should have held and severed critical wiring bundles that fed power to systems throughout the aircraft. Marcus watched his instrument panel transform into a Christmas display of warning lights and caution messages, each one representing another system degrading or failing entirely, each one narrowing the already impossible options available to him. The number 2 engine was destroying itself in ways that exceeded anything the certification standards had anticipated, throwing debris that was cutting through hydraulic lines and electrical conduits and pneumatic ducts, creating a cascade of failures that was spreading faster than he could process. He'd lost primary electrical power. He'd lost 2 of 3 hydraulic systems. He'd lost most of his flight controls except for minimal authority through the backup system that was never designed to fly the aircraft alone, that provided maybe 15% of normal control authority that might let him make gentle turns, but would never allow the kind of aggressive maneuvering that emergency landings required. Sarah was working through the emergency checklist with the kind of mechanical precision that training created, her fingers moving across switches and levers, her voice calling out steps and responses. But Marcus could see in her eyes that she was running the same calculations he was running, and arriving at the same impossible conclusion. They had maybe 12 minutes of backup battery power before they lost everything electronic. They had control surfaces that responded so sluggishly that turning toward the nearest airport would take longer than their remaining power would last. They had an engine fire that the damaged systems couldn't suppress properly that was burning through structures that protected the wing fuel tanks, that was creating a countdown to catastrophic structural failure that would tear the aircraft apart regardless of what they attempted. Marcus keyed the public address system, his hand remarkably steady despite the cold certainty spreading through his chest despite knowing what he was about to do violated every principle of cockpit leadership and passenger management he'd ever been taught. The microphone clicked live, and he heard his own voice filling the cabin, heard himself speaking words that no captain should ever speak, words that ended careers and destroyed the careful illusions that made commercial aviation psychologically tolerable for the millions who flew every day believing that professionals in the cockpit could always find solutions. This is your captain. I need to be honest with you. His voice was calm, almost conversational, stripped of the careful euphemisms that pilots use to discuss emergencies without creating panic. We are dead. I'm sorry. There's nothing more I can do. We've lost too many systems. The aircraft won't respond to controls. We have maybe 10 minutes before complete electrical failure, and we're too far from any airport to reach it, even if I could control the aircraft properly, which I can't. I've been flying for 23 years, and I know when a situation is survivable and when it isn't. This isn't survivable. I'm sorry. I wish I had better news. I wish I could tell you that we're going to make it, but I won't lie to you about what's happening. You deserve to know the truth. Use whatever time we have left however you need to. Call your families if the phones still work. Say your prayers if that brings comfort. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. The cabin erupted into sound that would haunt Sarah Chun for the rest of her life, assuming she somehow survived the next 10 minutes, which she knew she wouldn't. Screaming started immediately, not the brief shrieks that turbulence sometimes produce, but sustained howls of absolute terror. The sound of 241 people simultaneously understanding that they were going to die, that their pilot had just announced their deaths with devastating clarity, that even the trained professional they depended on for survival had given up and was telling them to prepare for impact that would kill everyone aboard. Parents were grabbing children and pulling them close, their faces contorted with grief, not just for their own deaths, but for their inability to protect the small bodies they held. Strangers were reaching for each other, seeking human contact in their final moments, creating instant bonds through shared doom that transcended the normal boundaries that kept passengers isolated in their separate rows. The flight attendants stood frozen in the aisles, their emergency training completely inadequate for a captain who had announced that everyone was dead, that procedures had failed, that survival was impossible. They'd been taught to manage passenger fears with confident reassurance, to project calm authority that suggested professionals had everything under control. But how could they reassure anyone when their own captain had just declared the situation hopeless? Lead flight attendant James Morrison found himself gripping a seat back for support as his legs weakened beneath him as a reality. Penetrated that he had maybe 8 minutes left to live, that his husband would never know what happened in these final moments, that his body would be recovered from a smoking crater and identified through dental records because there wouldn't be enough left to recognize. In the cockpit, Sarah was crying silently while still working through procedures that no longer mattered, her hands moving across controls from pure habit, because stopping would mean acknowledging that Marcus was right, that there were already corpses waiting for physics to catch up with reality. She was 29 years old. She'd been flying commercially for 4 years. She'd worked so hard to get here, had sacrificed relationships and financial security and normal life to pursue the dream of flying heavy jets across oceans. And now she was going to die in a cockpit that smelled like burning insulation and hydraulic fluid, was going to experience maybe 15 seconds of conscious terror as they fell from the sky before impact crushed every thought from her brain. Marcus sat with both hands on the control yoke, even though it barely responded to his inputs anymore. Even though the aircraft was essentially flying itself toward whatever terrain or ocean lay ahead, would continue flying until the backup power died, or the fire burned through critical structures, or the damaged engine finally tore itself completely free and took the wing with it. He'd made peace with death years ago when he started flying professionally, had accepted that every flight carried microscopic risks that might someday align into catastrophe. But he'd never imagined it would end like this, trapped in a cockpit with failing systems, knowing that his emergency training had proven completely inadequate, having to tell passengers the truth that pilots were taught to never speak aloud even when they knew it was true. Among the 241 passengers accepting their imminent deaths, sitting in seat 17C, dressed in jeans and a simple gray sweater that made her look like any other casual traveler, Major Elena Valkov maintained a stillness that was almost supernatural compared to chaos surrounding her. She'd removed her headphones when the first explosion occurred, had immediately recognized the sound as catastrophic engine failure from the distinctive timbre that civilian ears might mistake for ordinary mechanical noise, but which her combat experience identified with absolute precision. She'd watched the sequence of subsequent failures through the small cues that most passengers missed. The way cabin lights flickered as electrical systems degraded, the subtle change in engine tone as the number 1 engine compensated for the destroyed number 2. The barely perceptible yaw asymmetric thrust tried to push the aircraft off course. When the captain's voice came through the speakers announcing that everyone was dead, Elena felt the familiar cold calm settling over her thoughts. The combat mindset that had kept her alive through situations that killed other pilots, that transformed panic into tactical analysis. She'd heard declarations of certain death before, had been in cockpits where her wingman was screaming that they were going down, had flown aircraft so badly damaged that ground crews later asked how she kept them in the air long enough to make it back to base. She'd learned through fire and blood and watching friends die that impossible and unsurvivable were words that conventional thinking used to describe situations that unconventional thinking could sometimes solve. Elena had spent 12 years flying fighter jets for an air force that most Americans couldn't pronounce correctly, had logged over 2,000 hours in combat operations where getting shot at was routine, where bringing damaged aircraft home was a skill developed through necessity because ejection over hostile territory meant capture or death. She'd flown missions with hydraulic failures, with engines on fire, with control surfaces shot away, with instruments dead, with holes punched through her fuselage by anti-aircraft fire that civilian pilots would consider catastrophic. She'd learned to fly aircraft at angles and speeds that operating manuals said would cause loss of control, had mastered techniques that her instructors taught with the caveat that this will probably kill you, but it might work if you're skilled enough and desperate enough. She'd retired from military service 18 months ago after her last combat deployment, had deliberately chosen civilian anonymity over the defense contractor positions that former fighter pilots usually migrated toward, had spent the past year working as a consultant for companies that had no idea their quiet analysts had once dropped bombs on hardened targets while surfacito air missiles tracked her through darkness. She valued the peaceful obscurity of civilian life, enjoyed the freedom of traveling without security escorts or mission briefings, appreciated that nobody looked at her and saw a weapon. But as she listened to 241 people screaming around her, as she processed the captain's genuine anguish in that announcement of inevitable death, as she understood that commercial pilots had exhausted their training and found no solutions within the boundaries of conventional procedures, Elena recognized with absolute clarity that her combat experience had taught her to see possibilities that civilian aviation never acknowledged. The tactical problem the captain described, massive system failures, minimal control authority, limited time, was exactly the kind of nightmare scenario that military aviation dealt with regularly, that combat operations created constantly, that fighter pilots learned to survive because the alternative was dying in cockpits while enemies celebrated shooting them down. She stood up while everyone else remained frozen in their seats, while parents held children, and strangers clutched hands, and flight attendants stood paralyzed by their captain's declaration of doom. Other passengers barely noticed her movement, assumed she was having some kind of breakdown, thought maybe she was trying to reach the lavatory, as if normal bodily functions still mattered when they had 8 minutes to live. Elena moved forward to the cabin with the purposeful stride that 12 years of military discipline had ingrained. The walk that suggested she was moving toward an objective rather than wandering aimlessly. The body language that had once carried her across tarmac toward aircraft that she'd fly into hostile airspace. She reached the cockpit door and knocked with firm authority, the sound cutting through the chaos of the cabin. The intercom beside the door crackled, and James Morrison's voice came through, barely controlled, asking what she needed in a tone that suggested he couldn't imagine what any passenger could possibly need when they were all about to die. Elena leaned close to the microphone and spoke with the calm precision that she'd once used to radio tactical updates while her aircraft shook from nearby explosions. I'm a former fighter pilot. I survived worse than this. Open this door and let me help you. Or we're all dead anyway, so what do you have to lose? There was a long pause, and Elena could imagine the flight attendants and cockpit crew processing her words, trying to decide if she was delusional or genuine, weighing the absurdity of a random passenger claiming combat aviation expertise against a reality that they literally had nothing to lose by listening to her. The intercom crackled again and Marcus Webb's voice came through, exhausted and skeptical, but with a thread of desperate hope. What's your experience? Elena spoke quickly, knowing every second mattered, knowing she needed to prove credibility immediately. 12 years, multiple combat deployments, 2,000 hours in fighters. I've flown with engine fires, hydraulic failures, battle damage. I brought aircraft home with holes in the wings and control surfaces shot away. Your problem isn't that you can't survive this. Your problem is that commercial training doesn't teach the unconventional techniques that military aviation developed for exactly these situations. You said you have minimal control authority from backup systems. I've flown entire missions with less control than you currently have, You said you're too far from the nearest airport. I've made emergency landings at speeds and angles that your operating manual says will destroy the aircraft. Open the door. We don't have time to debate this. Another pause, shorter this time, and then the cockpit door lock clicked open with a sound that made several nearby passengers look up from their terror. Elena pulled the door open and stepped into the cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panel with the rapid assessment that combat pilots developed, the ability to process dozens of indicators simultaneously and extract the critical tactical information. Marcus and Sarah turned to stare at her, and she could see in their faces the mixture of desperate hope and professional skepticism. The instinct to dismiss a passenger is help wearing with the knowledge that they were already dead, so any chance was worth taking. The cockpit smelled like electrical fire and fear, the ventilation system struggling to clear smoke that was seeping from behind panels, the warning lights painting everything in shades of amber and red. Elena moved to stand between the two pilot seats, her eyes tracking across the engine instruments where number 2 showed catastrophic failure, and number 1 was running hot from compensating for the dead engine. She saw the hydraulic quantity gauges reading 0 on 2 of 3 systems, saw the electrical load indicators showing they were running on battery backup, saw the flight control status display showing that they had maybe 15% normal authority through the backup mechanical system. "Show me control response," Elena said, her voice cutting through their shock with command authority that made Marcus instinctively comply. He moved the control yoke left, and the aircraft responded with agonizing sluggishness, the nose barely beginning to track before settling back to center. Again, more aggressive. Marcus pushed harder, and the aircraft rolled maybe 5 degrees before the degraded controls couldn't provide more authority. Elena nodded, processing the information with tactical calculation. "Okay, here's what's happening. Your commercial training taught you that 15% control authority means you can't maneuver aggressively enough to make an emergency landing, which is absolutely correct for conventional approaches. But fighter pilots don't use conventional approaches when we're damaged. We use physics differently. Your aircraft is too heavy to control properly with degraded systems, so we need to make it lighter. How much fuel are you carrying?" Sarah checked the gauges. 42,000. We were only 2 hours into an 8-hour flight. "Dump it. All of it right now." Elena saw the horror on their faces and continued before they could object. "I know civilian procedures say you never dump fuel over populated areas, that environmental regulations prohibit it, that your company will face massive fines. None of that matters if we're all dead. Dumping 40,000 pounds of fuel will reduce your landing weight by almost 20%, which will directly improve your control authority by reducing the forces required to move control surfaces. It will also reduce your stall speed, giving us more margin for the unconventional approach we're going to use." Marcus was already reaching for the fuel dump switches, abandoning 23 years of ingrained caution, because she was right. Environmental fines didn't matter to corpses. Jet fuel began streaming from the wing dump ports, creating vapor trail behind them as thousands of gallons poured into the atmosphere. Elena watched the fuel quantity gauges dropping and continued her tactical assessment. "What's your current altitude and airspeed?" 34,000 feet, 320 knots, Sarah replied. "Good. You're going to start descent, but not the kind you're trained for. I need you to put this aircraft into a forward slip. Bank angle 30 degrees, opposite rudder, nose down 10 degrees. Your commercial training says that configuration is unstable and dangerous. My combat training says it's how you descend rapidly while bleeding off energy in a controlled manner when your normal flight controls are compromised. The asymmetric configuration will actually work in our favor with degraded hydraulics because we're using aerodynamic forces instead of relying on control surface authority." Marcus stared at her like she'd suggested flying upside down. A forward slip in a 777 at altitude. The aircraft isn't designed for that. The certification standards don't cover it. We could overspeed and break up. The aircraft isn't designed for surviving catastrophic system failures either. "But here we are," Elena said, her voice hard. "I'm not asking you to trust me because you like my plan. I'm asking you to trust me because your plan is to sit here for 6 more minutes and then die." Fighter pilots perform forward slips with battle-damaged aircraft all the time because sometimes unconventional aerodynamics are the only thing keeping you alive. Your fear is that you'll overspeed and structurally fail. My experience says that if you monitor your speed and adjust bank angle dynamically, you could descend at 4,000 feet per minute while staying within structural limits. We need to get down to 10,000 feet, where the air is thicker and your reduced control authority will be more effective. Sarah looked at Marcus, who looked at the altimeter, who looked at the fuel gauges still dropping as thousands of pounds poured away, who made the calculation that they were already dead. So, anything that offered even a 5% chance of survival was infinitely better than zero. He took a breath and banked the aircraft 30 degrees to the right while pushing the nose down and applying left rudder, creating a twisted flight configuration that made every instrument in the cockpit protest with warnings about unusual attitude and excessive bank angle. The aircraft responded with a sickening sideways slide, dropping out of the sky in a controlled fall that was part descent and part barely controlled plummet. The nose pointed at an angle that commercial pilots never used outside of initial training in small aircraft. The descent rate hit 4,000 feet per minute, and Marcus' hands were locked on the controls, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that he was going to kill everyone through this insane maneuver that no commercial pilot would attempt. But the aircraft held together. The speed stabilized at 340 knots, fast but within structural limits. And they were dropping through altitude bands so quickly that the altimeter looked like it was malfunctioning. "You're doing perfectly," Elena said, watching the vertical speed indicator. "Maintain this configuration until we pass through 15,000 feet, then start reducing bank angle gradually. Your passengers are going to be terrified by this descent angle. But terror is better than death." She paused, then keyed the public address system herself without asking permission. "This is Major Elena Valkov, speaking from the cockpit. I'm a former military fighter pilot, and I'm helping your captain implement emergency procedures that are going to feel very wrong, but which will keep us alive. The aircraft is going to make violent maneuvers that commercial planes never perform. This is intentional. Stay in your seats. Stay calm. We're not giving up." The cabin had gone from screaming chaos to shocked silence when her voice came through the speakers. Passengers trying to process that their death sentence had apparently been challenged by someone who sounded like she actually knew what she was talking about. Someone whose tone carried absolute confidence that they might survive despite their captain's earlier pronouncement of doom. Flight attendants grabbed seats as the aircraft's unusual attitude pushed them against bulkheads. As the descent rate made their stomachs float, as everything their training taught them about normal flight parameters was being violated systematically, they passed through 20,000 feet in less than 4 minutes. The aircraft still twisted in its forward slip configuration, still dropping at rates that should have triggered ground proximity warnings, except those systems had failed along with everything else. Elena monitored Marcus' control inputs, watching how he was adapting to the degraded flight controls, seeing that he was a skilled pilot who could execute her tactical guidance once he abandoned his commercial training constraints. "Start leveling out," she instructed as they approached 15,000 feet, "gradually reduce bank angle. Bring the nose up slowly. We need to transition to level flight without overstressing the structures. Your control authority is still minimal. So smooth inputs, nothing aggressive." Marcus complied, working the yoke with gentle pressure, feeling the aircraft respond with frustrating sluggishness as it slowly transitioned from its descent configuration back towards something approximating normal flight. The descent rate dropped to 2,000 feet per minute, then 1,000. Then they were level at 12,000 feet, with airspeed settling at 280 knots. "Status check," Elena said. "How much fuel left?" 8,000 pounds, Sarah reported. "We dumped 34,000 pounds in 6 minutes. "Good. That's enough to reach an airport with a long runway. What's the nearest suitable field?" Sarah was already pulling up the navigation display. "Peterson Air Force Base, 80 nautical miles northeast. Runway 1,331st, 13,500 feet long. We can make it if we maintain current heading and descent rate. Military base is perfect," Elena said. "They'll understand unconventional approaches better than civilian airports. They've seen damaged aircraft before. Radio them immediately." Tell them we're a civilian 777 with catastrophic systems failure, minimal control authority, and we're being advised by a former military pilot. Tell them we need emergency equipment stage, but that we're going to make an approach that violates all civilian procedures. Tell them to expect us in 18 minutes. Marcus keyed the radio while Sarah coordinated with Peterson's tower, explaining their situation with the kind of matter-of-fact calm that Elena recognized from countless military emergency broadcasts she'd heard throughout her career. The tower controllers at Peterson didn't waste time with questions or procedures. They simply cleared all other traffic, positioned emergency equipment, and told them they had priority handling for whatever approach they wanted to attempt. Here's what's going to happen, Elena said, speaking to both pilots now, making sure they understood the tactical plan before they attempted execution. Your commercial training taught you to make stabilized approaches, specific speeds, specific descent rates, specific configurations at specific altitudes, everything neat and predictable and safe. That's not going to work with your current control limitations. You can't fly a precision approach with 15% control authority. What you can do is fly a tactical approach that military pilots use when we're too damaged for normal procedures. She pointed at the navigation display, showing their track toward Peterson. We're going to stay high as long as possible to maintain energy options. We'll cross the field initially at 8,000 feet and 300 knots. Way too high and way too fast for any normal approach. Then we're going to perform what combat pilots call a tactical overhead brake. You're going to bank this aircraft hard left, as hard as your degraded controls allow. And we're going to spiral down over the runway, losing altitude rapidly while bleeding off speed through the turn. It's going to feel like falling with style. Your passengers will think we're crashing, but if you execute correctly, we'll roll out on final approach at the right altitude and speed for landing. Marcus looked at her like she was describing a suicide maneuver. You want me to spiral a 777 over the runway? Bank angles. That aggressive could exceed structural limits. And even if we survive the turn, I won't have enough control authority to stop the descent and flare properly for landing. You're thinking like a commercial pilot. Elena said, your manual says you need precise control authority to flare an aircraft for a gentle landing, but fighter pilots don't always get gentle landings. Sometimes we hit the runway hard because hard landings are survivable and no landings are not. Your landing gear is designed to handle descent rates up to 600 feet per minute. That's your margin. You're going to come in fast and high, bleed energy through the tactical spiral, roll out on final, maybe 50 feet above the runway, descending at 500 feet per minute, and then you're going to fly this aircraft straight into the concrete with minimal flare. It's going to be a crash landing by civilian standards. It's going to be a successful emergency recovery by military standards. Sarah was shaking her head, not in refusal, but in disbelief. Even if we survive the impact, we have engine fires and electrical failures. We could explode on the runway. That's what the emergency equipment is for. Elena said Peterson will have foam trucks ready to spray us down the second we stop moving. Fire is only catastrophic if you're in the air unable to land. Once we're on the ground, fire is a manageable problem that firefighters deal with every day. Our job is getting this aircraft to that runway. Their job is keeping it from burning once we get there. They were 60 miles from Peterson now, descending through 10,000 feet, the aircraft lighter by 17 tons of dumped fuel and handling marginally better, though still nowhere near normal control response. Elena could feel the tension in the cockpit, could see Marcus and Sarah processing her tactical plan and running against everything their training had taught them, finding that it violated every standard procedure, but recognizing that standard procedures had already been exhausted. I need you both to commit right now, Elena said, her voice carrying command authority that had once sent pilots into combat. This works if you trust my guidance and execute aggressively. This fails if you hesitate or second guess. I brought damaged aircraft home before. I know what I'm asking you to do seems insane. But I also know that what you were doing before, sitting here waiting to die, was guaranteed to fail. This gives us a real chance. Maybe 60% survival probability, which is infinitely better than zero, but only if you commit. Marcus looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Marcus. They'd been flying together for 3 years, had developed a kind of crew coordination that made commercial aviation safe, had learned to trust each other's judgment in situations where one pilot's mistake could kill everyone. Now, they were being asked to trust a stranger who'd walked into their cockpit claiming fighter pilot expertise, who was proposing maneuvers that their training explicitly prohibited, who was describing an approach that sounded like control crashing rather than professional flying. 60%. Marcus said quietly. You really think we have 60% chance of survival if you execute perfectly? Yes, Elena said. If you hesitate or deviate from my tactical guidance, much lower. But 60% is honestly better than I've had in combat situations that I walked away from. Sometimes you accept odds that would be unacceptable in peacetime because the alternative is dying for certain. This is one of those times. Marcus nodded slowly, his hands settling more firmly on the control yoke. Okay, we're committed. Tell us exactly what you need us to do. The next 12 minutes were the most intense flying that Marcus Webb had ever experienced, and that included the time he landed with one engine failed in a thunderstorm over Shanghai. Elena talked him through every step, her voice calm and precise, providing tactical guidance that went beyond standard procedures into the realm of combat aviation, where survival mattered more than regulations. She had them descend to 8,000 feet and stabilize at 320 knots. Far too fast for a normal approach, but exactly right for the tactical overhead brake she was planning. Peterson Air Force Base appeared ahead, the runway visible as a long gray strip cutting through Colorado landscape. Emergency vehicles already positioned along its length with foam trucks ready to deploy. The tower cleared them for the tactical approach, and Elena keyed the public address system one final time. This is Major Voliv. We're beginning our final approach. The aircraft is going to bank very steeply and descend rapidly. This is exactly what we intend to do. Do not panic. The maneuver will feel violent, but it's controlled. Brace positions when flight attendants signal. We will hit the runway hard. Remain seated until the aircraft stops completely. We're going to make it. They cross the approach end of the runway at 8,000 foot, going 320 knots. Impossibly high and fast for any normal landing. And Elena said, bank hard left. Now, did as much as you can get with degraded controls. Nose down 15 degrees, full descending turn. Marcus banked the aircraft hard over, pushing his limited control authority to maximum. The 777 rolling into a steep left turn that made passengers scream as the world tilted sideways, as they could see the runway directly below them through the windows, as the aircraft began spiraling down in a tight, descending turn that felt like falling. The descent rate climbed to 3,000 feet per minute, the speed holding as the turn bled energy through induced drag. The altimeter unwinding rapidly as they dropped through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. Steeper, Elena commanded, more bank. You're not turning tight enough. We need to lose altitude faster, or we'll overshoot the runway. Marcus pushed the controls harder. The aircraft responding sluggishly but banking steeper. The spiral tightening. Passengers pressed into their seats by the sustained turn loading. Flight attendants were shouting brace commands over the screaming. Their training finally providing something useful to do besides wait for death. For 1,000 feet, 3,000. The runway growing larger below them, rotating as they spiraled. Emergency vehicles tracking their descent. Start rolling out, Elena said when they hit 1,500 feet, gradually reduce bank angle. Bring the nose up slightly. We're going to roll out on final at 500 feet speed is good. Altitude is good. We're going to make this. Marcus rolled the wings level with aching slowness. The degraded controls responding just enough to align them with the runway center line. The aircraft stabilizing in something approximating a normal approach configuration, except they were 500 feet high and still traveling at 240 knots, 70 knots faster than normal approach speed. The runway threshold was rushing toward them, the wind streaking past the fuselage, the whole aircraft shuddering from the punishment they'd inflicted during the tactical spiral. Don't flare, Elena said firmly. You won't have enough control authority to arrest the descent properly. Just fly it straight into the runway. Let the landing gear absorb the impact. 500 feet per minute descent rate is perfect. Hold that precisely. Don't try to soften the landing. Marcus fought every instinct that screamed to pull back on the yoke, to flare the aircraft for a gentle touchdown, to save the landing gear from the punishment of a high-rate impact. But he trusted Elena's guidance and held the descent rate steady, watched the runway threshold pass beneath them, felt the seconds stretching as the concrete rushed up to meet them. The main landing gear hit the runway at 490 feet per minute with jarring impact that compressed the gear struts to their maximum design limits that made the entire airframe shudder, that threw passengers forward against their seat belts and bounced luggage out of overhead bins. The nose gear slammed down 2 seconds later, and Marcus immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the remaining engine and stood on the brakes, feeling the anti-skid system pulsing beneath his feet as the brake temperatures climbed toward their limits. They were still traveling at 200 knots, the runway disappearing beneath them, and Marcus had no idea if they'd stop before running out of pavement. Foam trucks were already racing alongside them, spraying white foam across the wings, where fuel was leaking and the engine fire was still burning, coating the aircraft in suppressive chemicals that would prevent ignition. The speed dropped through 150 knots, 120, 90, and finally 50 knots with 3,000 feet of runway remaining. The aircraft shuddered to a complete stop, and for a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit, except for the shrieking of warning horns and the hissing of foam still being sprayed. Then Marcus and Sarah both started laughing with the kind of hysterical relief that comes from being absolutely certain you're going to die, and then discovering you're still alive, that your body still functions, that you get to have a future that you'd already given up on. Elena keyed the PA system one final time. We're down. We're safe. Emergency slides will deploy in 15 seconds. Exit quickly but orderly. You all just survived something that conventional aviation wisdom said was unsurvivable. Be proud of yourselves for not panicking. Be grateful to your captain and first officer for trusting a stranger's tactical guidance. Welcome to Peterson Air Force Base. The emergency evacuation proceeded with remarkable order, considering what they just experienced. Passengers sliding down emergency chutes onto the runway, where medical personnel and Air Force security were waiting. Marcus and Sarah shut down all systems, secured the cockpit, and sat for a long moment, simply breathing, simply processing that they were alive when 15 minutes ago they'd accepted death as inevitable. Elena stood between their seats, her hand resting on Marcus' shoulder, and he looked up at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and awe and residual shock. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "Really?" Elena smiled slightly, a warrior's smile that carried weight of experiences that civilian pilots would never fully understand. Major Elena Volov, retired, 12 years with the Russian Air Force. 2,000 combat hours across Syria, Ukraine, and places that officially never happened. I flew COE Su-35s into situations that would give commercial pilots nightmares. I retired 18 months ago because I got tired of killing people and wanted to remember what normal life felt like. I've been traveling, consulting, trying to be invisible. Today, I guess my cover's blown. Sarah was staring at her with open amazement. You actually flew combat missions against SAMs and enemy fighters and everything. Everything, Elena confirmed. Anti-aircraft fire, missile locks, mechanical failures, battle damage, night operations, whether that would ground any civilian flight. I had Su-35 shot out from under me over Aleppo, took a missile hit that destroyed my left engine and punched holes through my wing, flew at 60 kilometers back to base on one engine with hydraulics failing, and half my instruments dead. What you just experienced. That was a manageable emergency by military standards. Challenging, but manageable. Marcus stood up, his leg still shaky, and extended his hand. Elena shook it firmly. You saved 241 lives, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'd already given up. I told everyone they were going to die, and you walked into my cockpit and refused to accept that death was inevitable. How do I even begin to thank you? You don't thank me. Elena said, you just did exactly what I needed you to do. You trusted tactical guidance that violated everything you've been taught, and you executed with skill that proves you're an excellent pilot. Commercial aviation teaches you to fly by the book, to follow procedures, to stay within established limitations. Combat aviation teaches you that sometimes survival requires throwing out the book and making decisions that terrify you. You just learned that lesson. Use it wisely. The aircraft evacuation had completed successfully. All 241 passengers and 12 crew members standing on the runway, surrounded by emergency personnel. Everyone accounted for with nothing more serious than minor bruises and one broken arm from someone who panicked during the evacuation slide deployment. Fire crews had successfully suppressed the engine fire, and foam coated the entire aircraft, which sat on the runway, looking like a giant beast that had crawled through snow. Its number 2 engine visibly destroyed, but the airframe otherwise intact. Air Force security was establishing a perimeter, while NTSB investigators were already arriving by helicopter, and Elena knew that her quiet civilian anonymity had ended permanently the moment she'd walked into that cockpit. Within 30 minutes, news helicopters were circling Peterson. Cameras capturing the foam-covered 777, surrounded by emergency vehicles. Within 2 hours, someone had leaked her name and military background to the media. Within 6 hours, Elena was sitting in a military debriefing room, answering questions from NTSB investigators, FAA officials, Air Force intelligence officers curious about a former Russian military pilot on American soil, and Boeing engineers who wanted every technical detail about the unconventional maneuvers she directed. Marcus and Sarah sat beside her throughout the debriefing, backing up every statement she made. The lead NTSB investigator, Thomas Crawford, listened as Elena walked him through her tactical decision-making process, explaining why she'd ordered fuel dumping, why she directed a forward slip descent in a heavy jet, why she'd insisted on a tactical overhead brake that violated every commercial approach procedure. What you're describing violates multiple FAA regulations, Crawford said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. Fuel dumping without clearance, aggressive maneuvering outside the aircraft certified flight envelope, an approach that exceeded maximum descent rates. Under normal circumstances, this would result in certificate action against the pilots involved. Elena met his gaze without flinching, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd used in the cockpit. Under normal circumstances, 241 people would be dead, and you'd be investigating a smoking crater instead of sitting here talking to survivors. I understand that my methods violated regulations that exist for good reasons. Those regulations assume that conventional procedures are available and effective. They don't account for situations where conventional procedures have already failed and death is the only alternative to unconventional action. I made tactical decisions based on combat experience that proved accurate. Everyone survived. If you want to punish Captain Webb and First Officer Chun for trusting my guidance when they'd already accepted death, that's your bureaucratic prerogative. But don't pretend that following regulations would have produced a better outcome than what actually happened. There was a long silence. And then Crawford smiled slightly, the first genuine expression Elena had seen on his face. I'm not here to punish anyone, Major Volov. I'm here to understand what happened so we can improve aviation safety. And what happened is that military tactics saved lives that civilian procedures couldn't save. That's uncomfortable for the aviation establishment, but it's also valuable information. He paused and added, for the record, I flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. I know exactly what you did up there, and I know how much skill it required. You have my respect. Even if you're going to give my agency headaches for the next year while we figure out how to write this report. The media circus intensified over the following days. News networks ran endless loops of the tactical spiral descent captured by Peterson's tower cameras. Aviation experts argue about whether Elena's methods were brilliant improvisation or reckless endangerment. Elena's face was suddenly everywhere. Still images from her military service records, video clips of her leaving debriefing rooms, telephoto shots of her trying to maintain privacy while reporters camped outside her hotel. The passengers began organizing immediately, creating a survivors group that wanted to publicly thank the woman who'd saved their lives. They arranged a press conference 3 days after the emergency landing, and Elena reluctantly agreed to attend because Marcus had asked her personally. The ballroom was packed when Elena walked in wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to hide her military bearing. Marcus stood at the podium and described with raw emotion how he'd given up, how a woman had walked into his cockpit and refused to accept death. Passengers spoke about their terror when their captain announced they were going to die, about the violent maneuvers that proved Elena knew exactly what she was doing. Then Elena stepped to the podium, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing that these people deserved to hear directly from her. She looked out at 241 faces who'd been convinced they were going to die 3 days ago, who were now standing here alive because she'd applied combat aviation principles to a civilian emergency. And she chose her words carefully. "I didn't save you to become a hero or to receive recognition," she began, her accent slight but noticeable, reminding everyone that she was foreign, that her expertise came from a military that Americans viewed with suspicion. "I saved you because I was on that aircraft and I had skills that could help in doing nothing would have meant dying along with you, which I've always been too stubborn to accept. What happened up there wasn't magic or luck. It was the application of tactical principles that military aviation developed through decades of combat experience, through pilots dying in situations that seemed unsurvivable until someone survived and taught others how they did it." She paused, choosing how much truth to share, deciding that people who'd faced death deserved honesty. Combat aviation is fundamentally different from civilian aviation. Commercial pilots are taught to operate within safe boundaries, to follow procedures that minimize risk, to maintain standards that keep millions of passengers safe every day. Fighter pilots are taught to operate beyond normal boundaries when survival requires it, to make decisions that accept significant risk because the alternative is certain death, to use our aircraft as weapons that we push to their absolute limits. Those are different mindsets, different skill sets, different philosophies about what's acceptable when fighting for survival. What I did in that cockpit, ordering fuel dumps that violated environmental regulations, directing maneuvers that exceeded structural limitations, planning an approach that required flying straight into the runway, those actions would be unacceptable in normal operations. They were only acceptable because normal operations had already failed. Captain Webb correctly assessed that conventional procedures couldn't save you. What he didn't know, because civilian training doesn't teach it, is that unconventional procedures developed through military necessity can sometimes succeed where conventional approaches fail. Elena looked directly at Marcus, who stood in the front row with tears streaming down his face. "You didn't fail as a captain. You simply reached the limits of what commercial aviation training prepares you for. When you announced that we were dead, you were absolutely correct based on everything you knew. The fault isn't yours. The fault is that aviation training segregates civilian and military knowledge so completely that commercial pilots never learn the combat survival techniques that could save them in extreme emergencies. You trusted a stranger's guidance when every instinct told you not to. That took more courage than anything I did." The press conference generated another wave of media coverage, focusing on the philosophical questions Elena had raised about civilian and military aviation knowledge. Aviation unions argued that Elena's methods were too dangerous for standard training. Military flight instructors argued that civilian pilots should receive basic exposure to tactical flying concepts. Safety regulators argued that existing procedures shouldn't be abandoned based on one dramatic incident. Elena watched the debate unfold as she traveled, trying to resume the quiet civilian life that had been permanently disrupted by 15 minutes in a cockpit. Defense contractors called offering lucrative positions. Aerospace companies wanted her expertise. She declined everything, uncomfortable with becoming famous for applying combat skills that she'd spent 18 months trying to leave behind. 6 weeks after the emergency landing, Elena received a letter from the FAA inviting her to serve as a consultant on a special advisory panel on unconventional emergency procedures, helping develop training materials that would give commercial pilots conceptual familiarity with tactical flying techniques. The letter acknowledged that her methods had violated regulations while simultaneously acknowledging those violations had been justified by circumstances. Marcus called her the same day, having received his own letter confirming that no certificate action would be taken against him or Sarah, that the FAA recognized it acted appropriately given impossible circumstances, that their decision to trust Elena's guidance would be studied as an example of effective crew resource management rather than punished as a procedural violation. His voice shook with relief and gratitude as he thanked her again, as he told her that he was still flying, but that every time he walked through pre-flight checks, he thought about how close they'd come to dying, about how her refusal to accept death had saved everyone he'd already mourned. The survivors group established a scholarship fund in Elena's name for young women pursuing aviation careers, raised over $200,000 in the first month. Several passengers reached out personally, wanted to meet the woman who'd saved them, wanted to understand experiences that had forged someone capable of such decisive action under impossible pressure. 8 months after the emergency landing, the NTSB released its final report. The report confirmed that Captain Webb's initial assessment had been correct. The combination of failures exceeded what conventional procedures could handle, and following standard protocols would have resulted in loss of control and catastrophic impact. The report documented how Elena's tactical guidance had succeeded, explaining each unconventional decision and why it had been effective despite violating established procedures. The report's conclusion generated continuing controversy. It stated that Elena's intervention had unquestionably saved 241 lives, while noting that her methods could not be recommended as standard procedures because they required skills typical commercial pilots did not possess. Elena attended the report's public release at NTSB headquarters in Washington, sitting in the audience beside Marcus and Sarah and representatives from the survivors group. She listened to officials praise her actions while carefully avoiding any recommendation that others should attempt to replicate them. Watched as reporters asked whether she represented a failure of current training standards or simply an extraordinary individual whose unique background had intersected with catastrophic circumstances at exactly the right moment. When they asked her to comment, she stood and spoke with the same directness she'd used throughout the entire ordeal. 241 people are alive today because combat aviation taught me skills that civilian aviation doesn't teach, she said simply. That's not a criticism of civilian training. Commercial aviation is extraordinarily safe precisely because it emphasizes standardization and procedure following that prevents the vast majority of accidents. But extraordinary safety in normal operations can create vulnerability in extraordinary circumstances when the procedures that usually work suddenly don't work and nobody knows what to do next. I knew what to do next because people shot at me for 12 years. And I learned how to survive when survival required abandoning procedures and making decisions that terrified me. That's the uncomfortable truth that this report documents but doesn't resolve. Sometimes survival requires warriors. I hope civilian aviation figures out how to incorporate that reality without compromising the safety standards that protect millions of passengers every day. She sat down to silence that gradually transformed into applause. Not the enthusiastic ovation that heroes received in movies, but the thoughtful acknowledgement that came from recognizing someone had spoken difficult truths that needed to be confronted. The debate would continue in aviation schools, in regulatory agencies, in cockpits where pilots wondered whether they could improvise effectively if conventional procedures failed. In military briefing rooms where fighter pilots discussed whether civilian training created dangerous gaps in emergency capabilities. Elena eventually accepted a position as a consultant with a company developing advanced flight simulation systems work that let her contribute expertise without requiring constant public attention. She flew commercially again, always alert to aircraft performance, always aware that other passengers had no idea they were traveling with someone who could potentially save them if disaster struck. 2 years after the emergency landing, Elena attended the Survivors Group annual gathering, an event that had become a celebration of life rather than a memorial to near death. Children who'd been on the flight were now old enough to understand what had happened to meet the woman their parents credited with saving them. Young pilots approached Elena seeking advice about careers in aviation. Journalists still wrote occasional pieces about her, usually focusing on broader questions about expertise and emergency decision-making and the boundaries between acceptable risk and reckless endangerment. Marcus found her standing alone on a hotel balcony overlooking Denver, watching aircraft approach the distant airport with landing lights cutting through dusk. He stood beside her in comfortable silence. Two pilots who'd shared an experience that neither could fully explain to people who hadn't been in that cockpit, who hadn't felt the specific terror of knowing you were dead, followed by the specific wonder discovering you were alive. Do you regret it? Marcus asked, eventually walking into that cockpit, revealing who you were, everything that followed. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about the privacy she'd lost, the attention she'd never wanted, the constant awareness that she would forever be defined by 15 minutes of tactical decision-making rather than by 12 years of service or the quiet civilian life she'd been building. She thought about 241 people who were breathing and living and loving because she refused to accept death as inevitable, about the children who would grow up to have children of their own, about the ripple effects of survival spreading forward, through time in ways that could never be fully calculated. No, she said finally. I don't regret it. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that you had to experience feeling like a failure when you'd actually done everything right. I regret that aviation training is so segregated that skills which could save lives are treated as dangerous secrets that commercial pilots shouldn't know. But I don't regret saving you, any of you. I became a fighter pilot because I believed in protecting people. I retired because I got tired of the ways military service requires hurting people to protect others. Walking into your cockpit let me protect people without hurting anyone. That's rare. That's worth whatever price I've paid in lost privacy. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memories of declaring his passengers dead, of being proved wrong by a woman who refused to accept his assessment. You taught me something that day. You taught me that sometimes the only thing separating impossible from possible is someone willing to try unconventional solutions when conventional wisdom has failed. I fly differently now. I look at emergencies differently. I understand that procedures are tools for normal situations, but that abnormal situations might require abnormal responses. You change how I think about being a captain. Good, Elena said quietly. Then maybe next time there's an emergency like that, you won't need someone like me walking into your cockpit. You'll already know that unsurvivable doesn't mean you stop fighting. You'll already understand that sometimes saving lives requires doing things that scare you. You'll already be the pilot who refuses to accept death even when death seems certain. That's the real lesson from what happened. Not that I saved you, but that you trusted me enough to implement solutions you'd never imagined. That's the skill that matters. Trust in unconventional thinking when conventional thinking has failed. They stood together watching aircraft descend toward runway lights. Each approach a small miracle of engineering and training and human skill, bringing tons of metal safely to Earth. Each landing a testament to the procedures and standards that made commercial aviation extraordinarily safe for millions of people who never considered what happened in cockpits or how pilots manage the constant low-level risks that characterize flight. And they both knew that somewhere, sometime another aircraft would face catastrophic failures that exceeded conventional solutions, would need pilots willing to think beyond their training, would require the kind of tactical decision-making that Elena had demonstrated, and that aviation authorities still didn't know how to teach. The sun set over the Rockies, painting clouds and shade that reminded Elena of sunrise over Syrian mountains, where she'd flown combat missions that now seemed like memories from someone else's life. She'd been a warrior who'd become a civilian, who'd been forced to be a warrior again for 15 minutes to save civilian lives. She carried all those identities now, unable to separate them cleanly, uncomfortable with the attention, but accepting that visibility was the price of survival, both hers and the 241 people who depended on skills she wished they'd never needed. Thank you, Marcus said simply. The words inadequate but sincere. For refusing to let us die, for walking into that cockpit, for being exactly who you are. Elena smiled slightly, a warrior smile that carried wave experiences that shaped her and scars that remained invisible. You're welcome. Now let's go back inside. Your passengers are waiting, and I believe someone mentioned cake. After saving lives together, the least we can do is celebrate them properly. They walked back into the gathering where survivors talked and laughed and remembered, where children played unaware that they existed because of decisions made at 34,000 feet by people who refused to accept impossible as final. Elena moved among them, accepting thanks and answering questions, and slowly making peace with being visible, with being known, with carrying forward the complicated identity of someone who'd saved lives through combat skills she hoped never to use again. And somewhere in the darkness above them, aircraft continued crossing the sky, carrying passengers who trusted pilots to bring them safely home, who flew without knowing the names or backgrounds or hidden capabilities of the people seated around them, who existed in the comfortable ignorance that made modern life possible. Most of them would complete their journeys without drama or danger. But somewhere, sometime another passenger might have extraordinary skills hidden beneath civilian clothes. Might be the difference between catastrophe and survival. might prove again that sometimes warriors choose peace but remain warriors in their hearts, ready to fight not against enemies but against death itself when circumstances demand the tactical thinking that only combat experience teaches. The story of Major Elena Volov in Transcontinental Flight 2847 will be studied and debated and referenced for decades afterward, would change how aviation authorities thought about emergency training and unconventional procedures, would inspire some pilots while making others uncomfortable with implications they couldn't fully resolve. But for the 241 people who'd been aboard that aircraft, who'd heard their captain declare them dead, and then discovered someone refused to accept that declaration, the story was simpler. They were alive. That's what mattered. Everything else, the debates, the regulations, the analysis of tactical decisions, was secondary to the fundamental miracle of survival against impossible odds achieved through the intervention of someone who'd learned through combat that impossible often just meant nobody had tried the right unconventional solution yet.